They laughed at the old man in court. They mocked his past, ignored his sacrifices, until he made one phone call, and the walls of power came crashing down. This isn't just a fight for justice. It's a reminder. Real strength doesn't fade with time. It only gets sharper. The morning at the Crestwood County Courthouse began like any other. Pale sunlight filtering through the towering glass windows, casting faint beams across the worn wooden floors, long faded by time. The old wooden benches creaked under the weight of those who had come seeking justice or something close enough to it. A soft wave of murmurs swept through the room as the courtroom doors swung open. Elijah Brooks, 76 years old, stepped inside, his shoulders slightly stooped, but each stride steady and firm, as if he carried on his back all the years the world had chosen to forget. An old brown shirt buttoned neatly to the collar, clean but faded khaki pants, and cracked leather boots, all spoke to a lifetime of quiet, unyielding labor. He removed his wide-brimmed hat as he crossed the threshold, a small, simple gesture of respect. Sadly, in this room, respect was a rare and precious commodity. From a judge's bench, Judge Marshall Grant, 58 years old, looked up. His face was cold, his jaw clenched tightly beneath thin, pressed lips. In that gaze, Elijah was not a man who had helped build the solid foundations of this town. No, to Grant, he was merely another useless old man. Just another burden on the system he fancied himself defending. Next case, Grant growled, making no effort to hide his irritation. Court Officer Blake rose and announced in a flat tone. Case number 771B, the State of Georgia versus Elijah Brooks. Charge, unlawful trespass on sealed property, address 415 Willow Bend Lane. Elijah approached the defense table alone. No attorney, no family, no one by his side, just himself, his old hat, and a dignity that had never learned how to bow. While ADA Lauren Mitchell, the young assistant district attorney, neatly adjusted her file, Judge Grant quickly skimmed the indictment. He didn't need to read much. In Grant's mind, Elijah Brooks was already guilty before the proceedings had even begun. At the Crestwood County Courthouse that day, no one came expecting justice. They were there for a quick verdict, a nod, a red stamp, to erase yet another aging name from the books. But Elijah Brooks hadn't come to beg. He had come, with his calloused hands, his steady eyes, and a story no indictment could ever truly imprison. Elijah Brooks stood silently at the defense table, his calloused hands loosely clasped before him, his fingers trembling ever so slightly, not from fear, but from age and the long, punishing years he had endured without complaint. In that cold, cavernous room, every gaze felt like a needle piercing through the threadbare flannel shirt he wore. But Elijah did not bow his head. He stood tall, quiet as an ancient oak that had weathered countless storms. No plea for mercy, no tears, only a silent pride. The kind of strength known only to those whom the world had turned its back on, and who had learned to carry their burdens without bitterness. Few in that room knew, or cared to know, that Elijah Brooks was not the useless old man Judge Grant so easily dismissed. He was a veteran, once serving in the United States Army Corps of Engineers, a man who had helped design and rebuild areas devastated by natural disasters, from bridges in the South to small hospitals along the coastal towns. He had once drawn blueprints not just with pencils, but with sweat, blood, and dreams. Dreams that now, to the man seated on the bench, were dismissed with a single, contemptuous word: criminal. Judge Marshall Grant leaned back, arms crossed, surveying Elijah as if he were a piece of outdated furniture ready for disposal. He didn't see the years of service. He didn't see the structure still standing strong against the storms outside. He saw only an old man with dark skin standing before him, and that was all he needed to pass judgment. ADA Lauren Mitchell kept her eyes fixed on the file in her hands, avoiding Elijah's gaze. Maybe, somewhere deep inside, a flicker of hesitation stirred. But the law, at least in this courtroom, did not always walk hand in hand with justice. And Elijah Brooks? He stood there calm and steady. He knew this game well. He knew that to men like Grant, he would always be an outsider, But he also knew another truth. Honor didn't need recognition to exist. As Officer Blake approached to escort him through the formalities, Elijah tilted his head upward, gazing at the soaring ceiling, as if searching for a sliver of open sky beyond the cold, indifferent walls. He had lived a life that never asked permission to exist. And today, no matter what, they would not make him ask permission to exist one more time. Judge Marshall Grant leaned his elbows against the bench, his cold eyes locked onto Elijah Brooks, as if facing a dull version of the hundreds of failures he had sentenced over 30 years on the bench. He gave a thin, humorless smile, one that carried nothing but brazen contempt. "Mr. Brooks," Grant began, his voice slicing through the empty courtroom like a dull blade, "I must tip my hat to your persistence. Not everyone has the audacity to return to a place where they no longer belong and to claim the right to do so." The sharp rapping of Grant's pen against the bench echoed across the room, a show of authority. "Perhaps," he continued, "in your mind, you see yourself as some grand figure, a fallen hero in a battle against a cruel world. But here, at the Crestwood County Courthouse, we do not rule based on sentiment. We rule based on law." A few people seated in the back rows, strangers, faces unfamiliar, shifted uncomfortably, avoiding the scene unfolding before them. ADA Lauren Mitchell darted a glance at Elijah, her expression softening for a brief moment before she buried herself back into the files, feigning busyness. No one spoke. No one intervened. Grant leaned forward, his gaze as sharp as a blade. "You no longer have any claim to the house on Willow Bend Lane. That past you're clinging to," he said, waving his hand dismissively, as if brushing away something meaningless, "has no standing here. Nostalgia," he emphasized the English word, "cannot substitute for legal ownership." Elijah said nothing. He stood firm, like a stone unmoved by the acid waves of contempt. "Or would you have me believe you were just sitting there reminiscing about your youth?" Grant sneered. "The cheapest excuse I've ever heard, Mr. Brooks." A few scattered chuckles came from the back. People who didn't know, or didn't care to know, that standing before them was a man who had once drawn bridges that stitched broken towns back together after storms, who had once raised hospitals that saved thousands of lives. But to Judge Grant, Elijah was nothing more than a walking indictment. Easy to judge, easier to trample. And in that cold courtroom, the blindness called power had won, at least for now. While Judge Marshall Grant hurled insults, his voice growing sharper with each word like nails hammering down a coffin lid, Elijah Brooks stood motionless, offering no defense. He didn't need to. His calm, the way he quietly absorbed every blow of contempt like winds brushing against a mountainside, slowly drained the courtroom of all noise. Elijah lifted his head, his gaze neither pleading nor angry, only unwavering and heartbreakingly strong. When Grant barked, "Do you have anything to say in defense of your blatant trespassing, Mr. Brooks?" Elijah gave a slow nod, his hands loosely folded in front of the defense stand. His voice was low, steady, and cut through the arrogance hanging in the room like a blade. "I was just sitting on the old porch. Not a word more, not a beat missed." From the corner of the room, Officer Blake instinctively tightened his grip around his flashlight handle, as if to hide the strange feeling creeping into his chest. ADA Lauren Mitchell froze as well, lifting her head for the first time, her eyes leaving the cold comfort of her files. Judge Grant narrowed his eyes, visibly irritated. "Just sitting," he scoffed, his laugh short and sharp like a knife. "You think that excuses you? Nostalgia isn't a deed of ownership." Elijah merely shrugged, a small gesture, but it weighed heavier than the entire courtroom. Not because he didn't know the law, but because he knew there were things, memories, blood, honor, that no paperwork could ever replace. And he knew, here, today, justice didn't sit on a set of golden scales. It hovered, silent and uncertain, in the eyes of those quietly watching. A few people in the gallery began to stir. The whispers, faint at first, started to ripple outward like waves. He was just sitting there, taken to court for that. The injustice, once buried beneath Grant's grandiose rhetoric, was slowly surfacing, not because Elijah fought back, but because he refused to lower himself. That silence, that quiet strength, was what began to warm even the coldest corners of the room. ADA Lauren Mitchell cleared her throat, rising to her feet, clutching the file tightly against her chest. Though she was young, with much still to learn, today, as she looked into Elijah Brooks' eyes, she knew something had been wrong from the very start. Lauren hesitated, then spoke. "Your Honor, considering the defendant's age, lack of prior record, and nonviolent conduct, our office recommends a lenient sentence, either a fine or a few hours of community service." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Several people nodded in agreement. A merciful sentence, everyone thought so, but Judge Marshall Grant only gave a cold, rusted smile. He planted both elbows on the bench, leaning forward, his voice rough with mockery. "Lenient sentence?" He repeated it, grinding each word as if crushing it between his teeth. For those who have made a habit of disrespecting the law, a heavy silence fell across the room. Grant slammed his hand against the bench. Men like Mr. Brooks don't learn from slaps on the wrist. And then, with deliberate cruelty, he delivered the sentence. 30 days in Crestwood County Jail, effective immediately. The words dropped into the room like a stone crashing into a still lake. You could hear the soft exhale, the creak of wooden benches as someone gripped their armrest tightly. A young woman in the gallery shook her head in disbelief. Officer Blake stared down at his polished black shoes, avoiding anyone's gaze. But the eye of the storm, Elijah Brooks remained perfectly still. No cry of protest, no furrow of the brow. He simply gave a slow nod, as if he had anticipated this verdict long before it was spoken. As if he knew that with men like Grant, justice didn't always speak immediately. Naomi Brooks, his daughter, still unseen, knew it too. Somewhere out there, she was waiting for the signal, and Elijah, with a calmness that bordered on the supernatural, understood. The real storm had yet to break. Court Officer Blake stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on Elijah's arm. The touch, though gentle, seemed to tear through the frozen tension in the room. But Elijah merely tilted his head slightly, his eyes bright with a quiet, unwavering fire, a silent message. "I'm not finished. You've only seen the tip of the iceberg." Officer Blake carefully positioned his hand at Elijah Brooks' elbow, preparing to escort him from the courtroom. Without a word of complaint, Elijah nodded, then lifted his head to meet Judge Marshall Grant's eyes directly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice as steady as a lake before a storm. "Before I go, I would like to make a phone call." The room fell into a prickly, uneasy silence once again. Grant raised an eyebrow, his frown heavy with the annoyance of a man far more comfortable giving orders than entertaining requests. "A phone call?" he repeated, voice dripping with disdain. "I thought you'd be saving that for your lawyer." Elijah only smiled, a smile without anger or pleading, simply certainty. Judge Grant waved a hand dismissively, begrudgingly. "Fine. One call. Make it quick." Officer Blake carefully pulled out his personal phone, unlocked it, and handed it to Elijah. Without glancing at the screen, without consulting any contact list, Elijah dialed a number slowly, deliberately, as if performing a solemn ritual. The ringing tone filled the air, slow and heavy. Inside the courtroom, every eye turned toward him, from ADA Lauren Mitchell to the reporters scattered among the back rows. No one understood what was happening, but everyone felt it. Something was shifting, threading through the very air. Then, when the call connected, Elijah Brooks neither greeted nor explained. He spoke only 4 words, his voice steady and sharp as a blade slicing through fog. "It's time. Bring them." That was all. He returned the phone to Officer Blake with a polite, deliberate gesture. No rush, no panic. Judge Grant arched an eyebrow again, annoyed. "Are we finished here?" Elijah nodded calmly. "Finished, Your Honor." But everyone in that courtroom could feel it. No one was truly finished. Because just as Elijah turned to leave, in the stillness that followed, heavy, synchronized footsteps began to echo from the hallway outside. Slow, deliberate, unstoppable. A storm was coming, and no one, not even Marshal Grant, could stand in its way. The sound of marching boots grew louder, each beat thickening the air inside Crestwood County Courthouse like a rising drum roll. Suddenly, the courtroom doors burst open with a force no one could have anticipated, sending a jolt through the stunned crowd. Standing in the doorway was a tall woman, her posture commanding, wrapped in a sharp black suit that looked more like battle armor than business attire. The hallway light framed her figure, making her seem almost luminous. Naomi Brooks, not just a renowned attorney, she was a sitting member of Congress, a respected voice throughout the entire state. Walking closely behind Naomi were three attorneys from Warren and Grant LLP, a law firm whose name alone could make even veteran judges tread carefully. Their arrival, silent yet thunderous, left the entire courtroom breathless. Judge Marshal Grant scowled, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on the glossy wooden bench. "This courtroom is adjourned," he barked. "If you don't have an urgent matter, leave immediately." Naomi didn't so much as blink. She strode straight to the defense table, where Elijah Brooks stood tall, his eyes calm and deep as a midnight sea. Without any grand explanation, Naomi placed a thick file squarely on Judge Grant's desk, precisely, firmly, decisively. "Before you add another mistake to your record," she said, her tone as serene as it was commanding, "I suggest you read this carefully." Grant gave a cold huff, pretending not to care, but his hand still seized the file. At just a glance through the first few pages, his complexion shifted from flushed pink to pale white. Deed certificates for the property at Willow Bend Lane. Architectural contracts signed by Elijah Brooks. Letters of commendation from the United States Department of Defense. Veteran service records adorned with an honor medal bearing Elijah's name. Every line of text struck like a hammer, pounding at the already cracking shell of Grant's authority. But the real blow landed when Naomi coolly produced an internal investigation order, signed and authorized by the federal prosecutor's office, targeting Judge Grant for a pattern of discriminatory sentencing throughout his career. The courtroom erupted into a frenzy of panicked whispers. Officer Blake instinctively took a step back, his expression wavering. ADA Lauren Mitchell's mouth fell open, her hand trembling as the pen slipped from her grasp. And Grant? All he could do was stare at the blazing red seals, realizing that the power he had spent a lifetime building was crumbling before his very eyes. And it had all begun with a quiet phone call, and an old man with an unbroken spine named Elijah Brooks. The air inside Crestwood County Courthouse seemed to freeze as Judge Marshal Grant slowly flipped through the pages Naomi Brooks had placed before him. With each line he read, the color drained further from his face. First came the proof of ownership. The house on Willow Bend Lane had never been foreclosed as he had assumed. The legal paperwork, verifying full, legitimate ownership, still bore the name Elijah Brooks, the very man standing silently before him. A murmur rippled through the gallery, and it didn't stop there. At Naomi's subtle signal, one of the attorneys behind her stepped forward, placing another thick file onto Grant's desk. The bold embossment on its cover reading, "Military Commendation Records." Judge Grant clenched his jaw tight. Inside that file, laid bare for all to see, Elijah Brooks, former military architect, credited with designing disaster relief systems for United States military bases. Recipient of the Pentagon's Meritorious Service Medal, with dozens of official citations for exemplary contributions. No one in the courtroom spoke. Even ADA Lauren Mitchell, who earlier had so confidently recited the charges, could only gape at the documents, her face ghostly pale. A man whom the court system had just tried to brand a wandering criminal was, in truth, a silent pillar who had helped build the very fabric of the nation. Officer Blake lowered his head, unable to meet Elijah's eyes. Naomi Brooks didn't need grand speeches. The truth itself roared louder than any defense ever could. Judge Grant stood frozen. The judge's robe suddenly seemed unbearably heavy on his shoulders, weighed down by the arrogance, the prejudice he had clung to for so many years. A deadly silence blanketed the room. Elijah Brooks simply stood there, his back still straight, his gaze still calm. He didn't need a shout to demand justice. It was his quiet, unbreakable patience that had forced the system to reveal its deepest, ugliest cracks. Judge Grant swallowed hard. For the first time during the proceedings, he was the one on trial. Not by a prosecutor, but by the truth in the eyes of every soul bearing witness. The silent earthquake had begun. The doors of Crestwood County Courthouse swung open, and Elijah Brooks stepped out alongside Naomi Brooks. No fanfare, no chaos, only the soft, golden light of noon pouring down over father and daughter, bathing their quiet steps in the glow of silent victory. On the stone steps outside, a crowd had gathered, half in reverence, half in uneasy awe. Cameras poised, microphones raised. Elijah paused for a moment, his eyes sweeping over the sea of faces. The same faces that had once thought they understood him at a glance. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. His presence alone, his unwavering dignity throughout the trial, had already engraved a message deeper than any words could. Naomi Brooks squeezed her father's arm gently, reminding him that they were no longer alone. She turned toward the waiting reporters, her voice ringing out across the worn stone steps. "Today," Naomi said, her voice clear and commanding, "we didn't just correct a wrongful sentence. We corrected a way of seeing." She paused, her sharp eyes sweeping across the gathering. Don't let the world define you by appearances. Because the things that matter most in a person, honesty, perseverance, dignity, lie far beyond the reach of shallow eyes. A gentle ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. There were quiet nods. There were eyes that lowered, unable to meet the gaze of the young woman standing before them. Elijah Brooks, 76 years old, the man once doubted by the court and judged by society for nothing more than his weathered skin and worn clothes, stood there, not as a survivor, but as a symbol that patience, truth, and self-respect were never outdated values. A symbol that justice, though delayed, could still be reclaimed. Not through power, not through rage, but through an unyielding resilience. Naomi grasped her father's hand as they stepped down the broad stone stairs onto the open boulevard. They didn't look back, because they knew the greatest victory was not being forgiven. It was never allowing the world to define your worth by first glance alone.